It started. All right. So this one will be specifically more related to mobile. It's titled Mobile Websites and Applications. Um, I'll just kind of try to go over in general what these means and try to elaborate on, since I will be setting up this PowerPoint and the recording to the teams. I've categorized types of mobile use here based on the presentation. So entertainment, search, communication, and some type of transaction. This is in general. This is how I see a lot of interactions, or most of the mobile interactions kind of go down. With that, just a few kind of quick stats. 75% of app sessions are 1 minute or less. Obviously the exception is like more popular long-standing apps where you have kind of that retention, but most applications, the sessions are 1 minute or less. 50% of mobile users abandon sites that take longer than 3 seconds to load. I think this is kind of a symptom of both technology and the nature of that last stat, right? So our interactions seem to be a lot quicker on mobile. Just kind of the amount of digestive information is a little bit shorter, kind of more truncated on a mobile platform than it is on, let's say, web. Just kind of the attention, the time resources different from mobile users to web users. So a lot of factors that kind of play into this stat. The average load time on mobile is 19 seconds, which is pretty interesting. I believe this data was collected in 2019. So average load time might be a little bit quicker now, but in general, somewhere around there, probably hasn't gotten light years quicker than that. Very interesting quote. When people have a larger device available, they prefer smaller devices, instead, simply. And what they mean by that specifically talking is, even if they have like a tablet versus a phone, people tend to gravitate more towards their phone, not necessarily saying, well, if I have a larger phone, I typically prefer a smaller one. We've seen kind of the trend in the opposite direction, where a lot of people now are trending towards a larger handheld phone device, as long as they can kind of operate it with a single hand, with, I'll put in quotes, relative ease, because that's kind of subjective per user. But they're comparing tablets versus phones. People tend to gravitate more towards a handheld simply because it's more convenient for them, and they always have their phones available to them typically. They call that device inertia. I thought that was really cool. So mobile apps versus mobile websites, there's a lot of kind of bouncing back and forth during this type of presentation. And that's because there's, some key UI differences between an application, and also key functional differences, right? Whether you have a native application versus whether you have like a mobile responsive website, those are expected different experiences from a user standpoint, and also from a business standpoint and development effort, et cetera. Those are all, they're different applications here. So I just kind of listed a few key points to take away. Mobile apps are optimized for repeated use. You have access to phone features and storage, meaning, password, like security options, login, registration options, et cetera. They're kind of a little bit more streamlined for actual native use. Offline usage is a big one, right? And then specifically, app-specific design patterns. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But with web, it's kind of, it lives within the browser, so you get that browser interface. Kind of leading up to the next point, the UI can help or interfere with the site. And then I don't know that I like the notion that it's one step behind apps, especially now in 2020 versus in 2019. But in general, I do kind of agree with this statement. There are obviously some exceptions to that. Web responsive websites are typically viewed as easier to access, and they don't take up, real estate on the actual app screen. So device strengths that are exploited in apps that are kind of advantageous to quote unquote native apps, right? You could utilize things like your device GPS, your camera, biometric authentication, whether you're using some pay service, you have your native or configurable keyboard, interact with things like a notification system that is built into your device, same with contacts, et cetera. So you could take advantage and exploit what they mean by exploit, but take advantage of those features in your mobile device building an application. There's some slight comparisons, kind of data based on Android versus iOS usage. This tends to fluctuate a little bit more fluidly each year. I remember a couple years ago or a handful of years ago, there was a pretty large difference or more noticeable difference. I think that's starting to kind of shift a little bit more, just with a lot more with capabilities of iOS expanding and then Android kind of shifting in terms of, they're constantly evolving what their stock or what their plain Android operating system looks like, and expectations and kind of design requirements and expectations for Android are kind of shifting. So just some basic metrics here. A lot of these are kind of broken down on the type of demographics. You'll notice, it still kind of holds true recently that a lot more technical jobs gravitate more towards Android platforms, as opposed to casual, frequent users who utilize iOS a little bit more. That's kind of the gist of what we talked about. And in general, that concept is still kind of holds true to this day, with some kind of fluctuation. And then we talked a little bit about, now we got into UI. So we're talking about initially like touch points on a mobile platform. And they talk about what's the acceptable recommended, CTA size, or just like hotspot size, and also the distance, the gapping, and recommended gapping. This is very, very specific, 0.4 inches, or a centimeter in actual size, because screen DPIs or pixel densities vary from device to device. They use actual sizing here, which I found pretty interesting. And this is a great example of how spaced out some of those call to actions are. A good example I wanted to include there. I always am interested in these hotspots. This reachability map used to be kind of a pretty big thing a handful of years ago. I remember at my previous job, this was a pretty big deal, but that has changed so much. So I'm less favorable to this type of map now, especially since devices have gotten larger. This doesn't account for user specific like hand size per se, and also doesn't account for change in mobile behavior. So this hotspot is kind of developed, I want to say a handful of years ago, and since then they've updated that into different types of maps that you see here. So this amended reachability map is something that's a little bit more accurate in terms of which areas are interacted with more. They've kind of generalized it now, right, to include, hey, these might be action areas versus like this might be a recommended content or feature area that you might want to have. And they could show, what does one-handed usage look like, or what did it used to look like? So that's why I included these hand graphics, right? So even though it's considered one-handed usage, somebody could be holding it with two hands, or somebody could be holding it with one hand while they're doing something else. Etc. So this is what they would consider like one-handed usage in the top or the left of the four leftmost quadrant. And then this is obviously two-handed usage here, demonstrating the difference. Then we talked about like signifiers for tappability. So the transition from buttons to, well, what quantifies an interaction, a call to action, and what are the signifiers of that, right? So we talked about good and bad examples of like signifiers. So two examples here. The one example on the left, using, text color and borders are good indicators, right? So the get button here, and then also standardizing the position. So they're talking about iOS and how they standardize these tab controllers at the bottom. And that's kind of the benefit of iOS, is they standardize their UI kit so that users, regardless of what device they're on, if they're using a mobile Apple device, they typically know where a lot of their buttons are going to be placed and what types of buttons you'll typically find there. And then in this specific Android example, they kind of notated that the standard positioning there with the three kind of hardware buttons, but also some software buttons up at the top. But sometimes without standardization, you get a lot of variance, right? So in this specific example, they said, well, sometimes a busy background, a lot of graphic heavy or content heavy backgrounds could be distracting. to a CTA, and there's not a lot of like standardization there, but some standard button positions.